Hey everyone, this is Brett Apley and welcome to the Daily Fantasy MMA channel. If you're interested in full DraftKings breakdowns, projections, expert rankings, bets, and a whole lot more, you can find that in our MMA premium content in the RotoGrinders marketplace. Make sure to follow me on Twitter at Brett Apley for all the latest news and developments in regard to the content, and please make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It's very much appreciated. What's up, everyone? Welcome to a special edition of the Daily Fantasy MMA podcast. My name is Brett Apley. Most of you guys know me as BB Bomb, and I am with my good friend Joe, also known as Sun Tzu. Joe, how is it going today?
Well, this is the special money edition of the Daily Fantasy.
It's true.
MMA channel.
It's not just a breakdown podcast here. We are here to talk and congratulate Joe for his big success on UFC Boise. Mr. Sun Tzu took down multiple tournaments, profited, looks like just about $13,000.
Close, yeah.
I see that the main lineup that took down all this money, you only entered $9.25 on this lineup, and you won $12,150. So I know a lot of people on Twitter saw this, but for those who didn't, can you just briefly recap how your UFC Boise card went?
Well, it was interesting. You know, this, as you mentioned, $9.25 does not constitute my prime lineup, right? So to be clear, and these are some points we made for those viewers who tuned into Alpha. One, we thought, you and I both, that this was a good GPP card. And two, we thought that this was a card where you didn't need 100% exposure to the main event, right? And obviously, if you look at this lineup, it does not have the main event covered in this lineup. Now, you know, what I did is I put 115 lineups into the $1 contest and the $8 contest, right? So, and as you referenced, I tied for first in both contests. Now, the way that I started creating lineups, you know, for these mass entry GPPs is I looked at inside the distance props for the fights, not so much the individual fighters, but for the fights. And then I just randomized, you know, lineups based on having multiple combinations of the inside the distance props, you know, for these fights. And that generated a certain number of lineups. And then the remainder of the lineups I kind of just built by hand. And quite frankly, you know, the lineups that I built by hand performed much worse. Although, you know, my primary lineup, I ended up actually, you know, making a profit on because, you know, it was in the 1,060 contest, and I was able to take second place in that contest simply because there was very little variance among the people in that contest. And it really came down to, you know, one or two fighters. And I believe, the only one in that contest to have played De La Rosa. You know, there were three people, I believe, or two or three people who played Renault. You know, a lot of us played Jury, so a lot of us got hurt by Jury. You know, so I was able with a disgustingly low score, I was able to actually take second place, you know, in that contest because there was very little variance.
Well, that's great. And as much as we are here to talk about the big money you won, and we'll get into the exact lineup in a bit, I think it's important to look at this not just from last week's perspective, right? If I go to your Twitter account, at which you can go to at Sun Tzu, scrolling down here, it was only on July 7th where you were a very frustrated man. You tweeted, "Hey, at Francis Ngannou, hope you can live off that plus 300 Derek Lewis wager, as anyone that pays a card to see you is an idiot." Followed by a GIF of you throwing up, followed by a tweet where you said, "After UFC 226, I am seriously contemplating going on hiatus from MMA." And this is you were serious. This isn't like a joke. We talked about this, you know, off air. You were very frustrated, and I think, can you take us like back a week or two? Like,
sure.
Were you going, what was going on? Was it just you felt like variance was going against you? You were just kind of tired of MMA DFS in general? What was it that had you so frustrated?
Look, it really goes back to Till Wonderboy, that card in Manchester, right? I thought, and I was supported by, the vast majority of the press corps that, Wonderboy won that decision. And, for me, that one fight would have made all the difference in the world, right? And then you go to Utica, where it comes down to the main event, Jimmy Rivera, Marlon Moraes. My guy Jimmy, I go with Jimmy. He gets knocked out. It came down to that fight, whether I was, going to have a really profitable day or lose. Then fast forward to the following week, you've got Whitaker and Romero. That was a bit closer. I still thought that either Romero pulled it out, or at worst case, should have gotten a draw in that final fight. Mm-hmm. And again, that makes when three cards in a row come down to the last fight as to whether you're making or losing money, and that's both in cash and GPPs. It gets kind of frustrated. And then what was the card? The card that we had prior to Vegas, prior to Tough and 226. Where was that?
I can't remember.
I can't even recall. I mean, I think I did okay. I mean, I didn't win or lose a lot in that card. It was really close. And then Tough, I didn't have a lot of action. And then again, it comes down to, in 226, it really came down to Ngannou. And as you know, I was actually playing a three-way tiebreaker for a ticket to the Knockout Challenge. And, Mike was out of it early. So it came down to me and Dr. Pimple Popper, and I needed like Ngannou to score, 30 or so points, and I couldn't even get that out of him, so that frustrated me when he didn't even show up to fight. I mean, that was one of the worst fights. So it really just left such a bad taste in my mouth, knowing that I was so close. Oh, I know what card we're talking about. We're talking about the one where where Buddha, where Mike had his big score. And what it came down to is, Mike, Buddha, and I had the exact same lineups in a lot of the same contests, with the difference being he went with OSP and I went with Tyson Pedro. And what really frustrated me is it was a late pivot from me off of OSP to Pedro. So essentially, hey, I'm happy that Mike won that money. Great for him. I would have tied him in every one of those contests had I not have pivoted off of OSP and onto Pedro. So, it was these things when you're so close and you're thinking you're there, and then all of a sudden, everything gets capped off by this heavyweight fight that everybody thought was a free square, and the fighter ends up not showing up. I mean, that just had me so frustrated.
Gotcha. And so talk to us about this last week, right? From what I remember, obviously you said this wasn't your primary lineup. You didn't even realize you were in contention for this big money until the end. And I'll read the lineup off now. We can talk about it. You had Volkanovski, which makes sense. You had Nico Price, big finish. Chad Mendes, big finish. Sage Northcutt, and then the two dogs, Barcelos and De La Rosa. So yeah, if I remember correctly, you didn't even realize you were in contention for this thing until the very end.
No, honestly, I didn't realize it until after the Northcutt fight was over and the score went final. And those of you who watched the card probably felt my pain, as it took DraftKings forever to get final stats loaded up. And as it turned out, for whatever reason, there was a couple of fights that they were behind on, but they were caught up on current fights. So it wasn't until, Northcutt went final and he got his 100 points and the other fights were caught up, and I hit like refresh on my phone and I said, holy shit, there's like, where did this come from? And I realized that I had, I was tied for first in the $8 contest. And you mentioned it. I mean, I only had 3 contests in that lineup, $9.25. So I really don't pay attention to those lineups all that much. I'm following my primary, and I had 1 main primary lineup, and then I had 4 secondary lineups. And those were the lineups I was kind of keeping on top of. And I'm like, wow, I got a real sweat here. And, I was sweating it out with another guy who was actually in premium chat, Roto Grinders premium chat. And he needed Dos Anjos and I believe 93 points. So I'm sweating out. And the funny thing was, I actually needed Dos Anjos to to
Dos
outscore
Santos.
Dos Santos. Sorry, Dos Santos to outscore Ivanov by 30 points to get second in the in the 1060. So
Right.
like on one hand, I want Dos Santos to at least outscore Ivanov, but I don't want him to score the 93 points that the other guy needed to pass me. And I actually had the same lineup that he had. So I would have actually, did I? No, he had. I would have actually tied for second place if Dos Anjos won, because I finished first and sixth in that contest. But there were so many people that tied for sixth that it was not a really huge payout.
And the big thing looking at this lineup again is what seems to have made the most difference here is that you went Chad Mendes over Dos Santos. You didn't have either fighter in the main event. And I know that you had talked about Chad Mendes during the week as a strong play. We had both mentioned this week as a potential to fade, or not fade, but make lineups
100% exposure
to the main event. Correct.
Right.
So do you want to talk a little bit about that? It seems like not a ton of people were on Chad Mendes. Obviously, the line dropped drastically. He was a near pick'em with Miles Jury. Miles Jury super popular. Mendes ended up not being that popular, and that's really what made the difference for you.
Look, I'll be honest, I had way more exposure to Jury. Jury hurt a lot of people. It's yet another week where line value comes and bites you in the ass. And we talked a little about this offline, how you really your process has to continually evolve. Like, there are weeks when, line value is better to follow than other weeks. But I think as we've seen recently, more people have gotten burnt by line value over the course of the last month or so, than have benefited. And, in hindsight, it's always easier to analyze in hindsight. But, you have a guy who's coming off a long layoff who hands down fought a much higher class of a fighter than Miles Jury. And seemingly Miles Jury lost, to whenever he got into a fight with someone high quality like Donald Cowboy Cerrone, he lost, and he lost pretty decisively against, Mendes, who, took the first round off of McGregor before gassing out, and obviously he was viciously knocked out by Frankie, and then he took some time off. So he really was the class. I mean, the variance or the narrative behind Mendes was, okay, he's had such a long time off. Jury has been a lot fresher. But on paper, Mendes was the favorite. Mendes should have been the favorite. And the line value just sucked so many people in. And I was telling you how in the 1060 contest, I believe 6 of us out of 10 had Jury. So we all got burned by Jury. Right. And he scored, what, a half a point, I think.
Yeah.
Which is horrendous. You don't get anything out of a guy. It's really tough. So, look, I wish I could take credit for hand constructing that lineup. But in all honesty, that was one of those lineups where I mentioned the process before. I looked at inside the distance fights. And, I took, I just did some randomization and tried to match up different combinations, and what I thought were the top 5 or so lineups within each category and put them in, which is why I wasn't really on top of that lineup, during the course of the night. And I didn't know about it until, after Norcut went final. I mean, I was actually rooting for Otto in that fight because I didn't know that I had another lineup, which was a close to perfect lineup with Mendes in it that, had Otto, and that was one that I had more invested in. So, it really was a bit of a shock when I hit refresh and I see, oh, wow, okay, this is one of the 115 lineups I played.
Well, it really was a great lineup, and it won a ton of money. I was very happy to see it. I know a lot of guys in the industry are very happy to see it. You definitely deserve it. Let's kind of wrap this thing up because now we're able to look back in hindsight, right? And I joked around about those tweets, but I think it's important for people to understand, like, you had a rough stretch and you were frustrated, and you made that very clear. But this game is a long-term game, and it is beatable long-term. And so I'm wondering if you can put on, your hindsight cap and look at the past and now, like, what would you get? Like, can you take give advice from this stretch? And what would you say to people maybe who are also going through this?
No, absolutely. And I think here's the thing. I mean, I truly believe that you have to continually evolve and work on your process. I mean, I shared this, I know, in I think one of the early episodes of Alpha, like how we all got involved in this MMA DFS thing. And people can look at me and say, oh, guy's got the bankroll, right? He can play 115 lineups, right? I, I've got limits to what I can play, right? The first time I played MMA DFS, I invested, I want to say $16, and I turned it into 400. And I simply used the bloody elbow consensus staff picks to create my lineup because I was like a casual fan of MMA. I wasn't really I wasn't a diehard like I am now. And I will tell you, I mean, it's become close to a second vocation for me. I do have a day job, but I mean, I easily put in 20 hours a week, of research into a card. And that's listening to pods, that's lineup creation, that's, reading anything that's out there, following Twitter. I mean, it's really hard if you're going to put, an hour or 2 hours a week into this and think that, get pissed off because you lose. Well, I mean, come on, it's a hobby, right? Maybe you want to throw a few bucks on it to make the fights more interesting to watch. I've not missed a UFC card since early 2015. Again, 20 hours minimum per week and lineup creation and, you getting to learn the camps, not just the fighters, but where they're training and what does a camp move mean? Like moving from one camp to another camp. And, again, I'm a bit more into the narrative than you are. But the other thing is, what I like about this is that it's not as math oriented as some of the other DFS sports. Like it's not as stats driven as basketball or baseball, or even football. So you can actually, if you put in the time and you watch fights and you look at styles, right? I mean, that's that is going to pay dividends for you. You don't have to be, one of these ex-poker kids, who are out there who are killing it in baseball and basketball because they're looking at WOBA and ISO and they know all these sabermetrician stats and how to generate lineups and have big bankrolls. I mean, there's a great piece to listen to with Condia, right, who was one of the all-time great players. And, he said that on a given Sunday, he'd have $500,000 out between DraftKings, FanDuel, and Yahoo. And that is the epitome of a full-time player. But, I mean, this is a guy that is into all that. MMA, you don't need to be a math brainiac. You can watch film. I mean, there are things to do that don't require a lot of math. So my advice would be constantly evolve your process. Don't be quick to drop on line value. Line value, I think, means more depending on who the fighters are. And don't just blindly follow Vegas. I think it's a good tool, but it's only one tool. You've got to look at multiple tools. And one of the reasons why, and we talked about this off air, why I wasn't as excited as I might have been about the win is because, I got sucked in to Jury like a lot of people. I was overexposed to Scoggins when in hindsight, I should have realized even if he won, right, he still was only going to score less than 50 points because he's a stand-up points fighter in the Wonder Boy mode. I should have played, one of those female fighters that I had pretty strong opinions about, but didn't think they were great DraftKings plays. So I was a little upset.
For sure. And I appreciate the insight that you just gave us there. And just to piggyback off talking about the process, like I do think it's very important to evolve, like you said. And again, this is a long-term game. Losing 1 week in the scheme of things doesn't really mean anything. You have to understand like there's so much variance in this game. And talking about the line value, like in MMA Premium, the content that I run, I always talk about line value. In the long run, these are a good place to target. But on the other side, like there's two arguments to this, right? They're a good place to target, but if the majority of the public is going to shift their plays over to Miles Jury, for example, leaving a guy in Chad Mendes who we know has power, we know can finish inside the distance, and he's going to be under owned, like those are good leverage plays. And so we'll get these strings of cards where the line value hits every single time. And then it's like, okay, we all have to go in on line value. We all have to play. And people get so caught up in that because it's like a recency bias. And then we get these strings of cards where the line value doesn't work. And so it's important to just look at it from both sides because, there are arguments for line value, but it's always important to, again, look at the other side of the coin, knowing that you're going to get leverage on the other side of it. Regardless, I think I appreciate you doing this.
Of course.
I think that a lot of the advice you gave was helpful. And once again, congrats on the big score. I mean,
thanks.
Take it $18,000. I think $13,000 of profit. That is very impressive. I know a lot of people look up to you in this space. And like we say, you can win money in this game. Try not to get discouraged, try to improve, try to learn. And hopefully you'll be the next one I'll be interviewing. I'll say that. So thanks again, Joe. And we'll talk to you soon, buddy. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, guys.